going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man? Do you have Corona yet?
No, man. I'm good, I think, but chilling as per usual.
Have you gone through any paranoia?
No, I have not, because I read a lot about this, and yeah, I mean, I'm not concerned, but also my level of paranoia is, pretty well mitigated, I think.
Well, that's good to hear. I've been pretty calm about this entire situation for a while now. However, yesterday was my breaking point.
Oh,
I did kind of have a breakdown.
Did you have a subway situation?
Exactly.
I got one for you too. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah.
So I was on a train the other day or yesterday, and I'm going up home at peak rush hour, and I get on the train. It's almost empty when I get on the train, so I'm like, oh, okay, great. I'm gonna be in a very germ-free zone.
Mm-hmm.
There's not too many people here. The infection can't spread. And then I get to the next stop. A horde of people come in. A horde of people, and I'm like, fuck, this is bad. And then next stop, another horde of people come in. And now we eventually get to the point where this is a very, very packed train going uptown on the train that's moving very slow as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting down because I get on the train at one of its first stops in Manhattan, and a little boy sits next to me. And this little boy he looks dirty. He looks like a filthy little boy. And he starts eating popcorn. His family's there too. He starts eating popcorn like outside of a Tupperware that his father gives him. And I look over, and his sweatpants are dirty, and I'm just like, oh, this kid is a bag of disease right now. I'm getting it.
Patient
There's
zero.
no chance. I'm done. I have no chance. And I went through a bit of a freak out where I'm somebody. So I don't know if this is a psychological disorder or what. So, but when I think about swallowing, I'll like forget how to swallow if I think about it. Do you ever hear of that? Have you ever heard of that?
It's kind of similar to like if you think about yawning, you have to yawn.
Yeah. So if I think about swallowing, I'll be like, uh-oh, like, how do I swallow again? It's a weird psychological issue that I have. And I ended up getting that in the train. I was like, my lungs are swollen. My lungs are getting tight. I need an inhaler, somebody. So there was a good 45 minutes where I was like, I'm a dead man walking right now. I have the virus, and I'm going to get it to everyone I know and love.
Well, good thing that we do our podcast virtually, because you can't give that shit to me. Ha!
Well, I heard somewhere that you can give Corona through electronic devices, right? Through the internet. That's the number one way you get it.
Yeah, fake news.
No, but I'm good. I don't have any symptoms yet, at least I mean, I have psychological symptoms, but not coronavirus symptoms.
Right. I was on the subway today, and on the way home, and it was a pretty empty train at our stop because we were very close to each other at work, and pretty empty. There was an open seat. I sit down. This woman just springs up and like starts freaking out. Like I'm thinking logically, she's probably just like freaking out about like coronavirus or some shit, and maybe thought I had it. But just turned out to be a regular New York crazy. She was just like, "Don't you look at me, motherfucker!" Like blah blah blah, and she like storms off and goes to another car. And I'm like, "All right, welcome to New York. If you thought you were gonna have an empty seat next to you the whole time, you're sorely mistaken." But yeah, no, I'm good. But I do want to talk about coronavirus today, and kind of like talk a little bit about the global implications. The economy for sure. And kind of some of the geopolitics that's going on, not wholly unrelated, but definitely related in that respect. So I guess maybe we can just jump right in, so we don't get any bad reviews about us rambling on for too many minutes in the beginning of a show. Cool. So Iran. Have you heard much about Iran in this coronavirus situation?
So what Iran is number 2 on the death poll right now.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So
China's 1, Iran 2, Italy 3.
right.
What 4 is?
Actually, I think they might have flipped. If I'm reading this correctly, because I just pulled some sources from as early as today. Yeah,
This is Tuesday at 9:53 p.m. So
yeah, I think they flipped. But we'll get to Italy in a second. In general, they're both really bad, right? So Iran, as of this article from the BBC, said that they reported 43 new deaths in the last 24 hours, which is fairly high. So 237 people in Iran have died. 7,000 plus have been infected across the country. And, they've done some measures to like curtail the spread by closing schools and telling people not to travel and stuff like that. But as of right now, Iran, fairly authoritarian country, has not put like any cities or any major areas or hotspots on lockdown, unlike China and Italy. But we'll get to Italy in a second here. If you remember from a couple episodes back, I was pretty shocked, I guess, and amazed that China was able to lock down an 11 million person city, Wuhan, and the surrounding provinces, and just kind of the implications of that. But I found it pretty interesting that Iran, of all people, would decide not to, especially given the fact that they're the second or third hardest hit country, for this particular thing, and kind of a interesting. I chuckled a little bit, but thinking back on it, I think it probably shouldn't have. Kind of an unrelated development. 16 Iranians died recently from methanol poisoning because there were some false rumors that was spread about drinking alcohol. Like apparently they thought that drinking alcohol would prevent you from getting coronavirus.
Wait. You're saying that drinking alcohol doesn't prevent you from getting?
Apparently not, but I think they were
it's like
drinking
the STD
pure
myth.
alcohol.
It's the way to cure all of your STDs is to get every single STD, and it's kind of like a blocking door. You ever hear that myth?
I have, yeah. I think I remember hearing that during like orientation in college, and then them saying
that's not true. Don't go on that journey.
You don't want to go down that path. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy in Iran. Also pretty interesting for like a geopolitical perspective. Their parliament is not immune to this either. 24 members of Iran's parliament, which is about 10.
Your sirens are getting loud.
Yeah, I know. They don't want me to talk about it. All right, I think we're good. Oh, motherfucker.
It's the quarantine.
Yeah, seriously, they got me on lockdown
this is
here.
For people, first-time listeners, everyone who listens to this regularly probably understands that we have frequent sirens that just show up unannounced and unexpected times, and sometimes we get very frustrated on air with dealing with it.
Totally. Where was I? Okay, 24 people. Iran's parliament, they died. That's 10% of their parliament. Excuse me, they didn't die, but they have coronavirus, and 2 of them have died, right? And so the 2 that were there, so a couple of notable people here. Fatima Rahbar, he's a conservative who had been elected to represent Tehran, and Muhammad Ali Ramazani, who had been elected in Gilan. Both of those guys have died from coronavirus. And I mean, that's pretty crazy. I mean, it sucks to say, but like when normal plebeians end up getting a virus or, some kind of pandemic and they die from these things, they just end up as a statistic, some number. But when these figureheads start dying, the gravity seems to increase somehow, but for whatever reason, Iran still isn't locking anything down. So I find that to be a pretty interesting development. What do you think about that?
Well, you got to look at the reason why Iran has such a high level of coronavirus, and it's mainly because of sanctions that prevent them from trading with the rest of the world. They have to rely on imports from China. So they're big trading partners with China, and you'll see that Italy is a huge trading partner with China as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So all these really big trading partners with China are the ones that are getting it.
Right, and we trade with China too, so we're not immune from that. But we'll get to that point though.
But where Italy and Persia are both located. They're both located at strategic trading posts. Persia being pretty much in the border between the Far East and the Near East, and Italy being right over in the Mediterranean. Italy has a high. I forget the name of the Italian city, but they had recently signed a deal with China for the One Belt One Road
Right. Initiative. Right.
initiative, and then Iran is just pretty much forced to trade with them out of not having other options.
Right.
So those are the countries. It's not a surprise that they have it. As far as Iran not taking the same precautions as a country like Italy is, it could be something for the public. I can't really tell you exactly why. Maybe they think it's not going to spread to a certain degree just because of the geographic conditions of Italy being not Italy, excuse me, of Iran being very mountainous. But that's just like purely me throwing shit on the wall and speculating out loud.
Yeah, some other speculations I've read, kind of paint this as like a machismo play, like they're trying to downplay it, so they're not going to lock anything down so that people won't get freaked out, And that seems like, Occam's razor, like the simplest answer. But, with a country like Iran, we may never know. Like, we may never find out. But something that we can find out is Italy. And Italy's developments have been pretty crazy. When they started getting hit with the coronavirus, they started locking down particular, areas of their country. So I know that in the far north, they were locking that down. And now, as of very recently, they just decided, well, the whole country, all 60 million of them, locked down. The entire country, which is nuts because when you look at this in the context of other countries who have been, doing this, like for example, China is a, fairly authoritarian regime, right? So they locked down Wuhan and surrounding provinces, and that, was concerning, but also, not totally unexpected, right? I can see them doing that. But Italy's a Western country, and they value their freedoms. They're pretty up there. For them to lock down the entire country is something else. So, I mean, these restrictions came about, because of just the staggering number of infections and deaths. So they announced, I think it was today, that 9,172 people had been infected by the virus, and that was like 1,600 more than the previous day. And their death count has risen to 463. And of course, the majority of these people are elderly and sick people, so the people that are most at risk here. But that's been, 97 more deaths since Sunday, which is a lot over that short a period of time. And so the country's prime minister, Giuseppe Conte, he basically adopted the China model here. He said, all right, well, he was looking at China and he noticed that, as of today, they're actually the rate of infection is slowing in the Far East. So he was just like, let's just lock it down. But it applies to like 60 million people, all the way from the north in the Alps to, the southern islands and things like that. And that's, it's kind of crazy because, again, this is a European Western country, like how are people going to react to this? Are they going to play ball? Logistically, how are they going to do this? This is something that I'm interested in, that I'm going to try and follow a little bit more because it's kind of an interesting social experiment almost, could this be done in a Western country and what are its implications? Basically they're going to have to make some concessions, when they do this. They're going to allow people to move around limitedly with permission. So things like, if they have to move around for work or they need to go somewhere because of health reasons or, something else, if you get permission, you can do that. But what's funny is that Giuseppe Conte is allowing foreigners to still come to Italy. So, not you can't move around in Italy. If you live in Italy, you have to stay in Italy. But if you're a foreigner, you can still come visit the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So if you still wanted to go, you can.
Well, tourism is a huge revenue generator for Italy, so
Of course.
shutting down tourism would be disastrous, especially if they're shutting down the rest of their economy. People aren't going to work and
For
are
sure, it's just
basically
totally ironic, though.
quarantined.
It's just totally ironic, though, because if they have the idea that this is bad enough to lock down an entire country, but they're cool with people coming in and risking themselves to come in. Like, I think if you decide to shut down an entire country, nobody's going to want to come to that damn country. You know,
It's like somebody being open about, like, hey, just will let you know I have herpes.
right? But we could still smash, though, if you want. You know,
You can
if
still
you
smash,
want, right?
but I'm legally obligated to tell you that I have herpes.
Right. So I mean, they're doing things, you know, kind of along the same vein as a lot of other places. So, you know, schools and universities are going to be closed until April. One interesting one was they've banned jail visits, and they also have this like day release program for some inmates, and that apparently set off a bunch of riots in the country. And like guards were held hostage, and a bunch of inmates died in Modena. Which is crazy. Obviously, all sporting events are, you know, shut down. Another sucky one is 6 p.m. curfew on bars. So Conte said that the days of young people gathering at outdoor events and pubs were over. So, you know, it's going to be boring as fuck. You can't move around, you know. But you could still visit Italy. You just happy hours start a whole lot earlier, I guess.
I wonder what like the average hotel room would be right now to go to Italy. It's probably a great time to save some money visiting Rome when you think about it. I've never been to Rome or Italy.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, let's go. Let's plan a trip.
I'll pass, but that's cute. You might not be able to come back in the country because, you know, they're stopping you at the customs border and asking people, you know, have you been to Italy? Have you been to Iran? Have you been to China? I know this because I've got some the company I work for also has an office in Berlin, and you know they travel back and forth every now and again, and they, you know, I've been getting some fun feedback from, you know, those folks that are making those trips, that coming back into the States, they're asking for, you know, that information. I don't actually know what they do with you if you say yes I have. I don't know.
What's interesting is I saw that Germany has a pretty high rate of corona as well.
Yep.
But they have very few deaths.
Yep. Maybe
which I was surprised.
Awesome healthcare system that they have, but that's neither here nor there. So, all right. So you lock down an entire country, right? And the implications of this is like, you know, obviously tourism is going to suffer, but also just regular economy, domestic economy in Italy is going to suffer, right? You know, people won't be able to go to particular jobs. You know, people won't be able to, you know, make a living. And what I found super interesting as a juxtaposition to the fact that they're locking down an entire country is that, you know, Conte and the Italian government have basically implemented a mortgage freeze, right? So they basically said, Italians, if you got a mortgage, you don't got to pay it. So that's cool, I guess. So yeah, I mean, it's one way to address the issue of like people won't have any wages if they're not going to work, and that's particularly good for those people.
Well, people won't be able to pay their mortgages with most people who are paying their mortgages. If you freeze their income by an extended period of time, they won't be able to make their next mortgage payment anyway.
Right, and it's smart what they're doing, but it's, you know, it's definitely. I don't know how to articulate how I feel about it, but, you know, I feel good about it overall. You know, generally speaking, I think, you know, if you're going to make that choice to lock down an entire country, you also have to make sure that the people that, you know, are in that country aren't going to like starve and lose their homes and shit. But I wonder what those implications are for the, you know, for the local economy. And Italy isn't necessarily the strongest economy in Europe here, you know. So yeah, I mean, it was the smart thing to do. But I wonder what that means for that economy. I guess only time will tell. Even the British bank RBS said on Monday that it would also defer mortgage and loan repayments for up to 3 months for anyone that's got, you know, coronavirus or is affected by the coronavirus.
Did they say that they would not raise interest rates when coronavirus has passed?
I don't know that yet. There's not a whole lot of details coming out about this because this is fairly new. But yeah, I mean, this is an interesting way to like mitigate the economic impact of shutting down an entire country, and I think I'm just curious about how it's going to pan out. Because that kind of turns us to like our country, like what's going on here, what are we doing, and while we're certainly no Italy, China, or Iran, we are getting increases of cases. And in particular, I think the state of Washington got shut down. And, all across the country, schools are shutting down. My sister is in college right now, and I think they just shut that one down. My other sister's in high school. They shut that down. They're going to be doing like remote classes. Companies all over New York City are implementing, mandatory work from home. My company hasn't pulled the trigger on it yet, but I can work from home whenever I want. So if I choose to, I can just go home. Massive gatherings have been canceled. Most notably that I learned about is South by Southwest, which happens in Austin, Texas. That just recently got canceled. And this is a huge week-long like tech and music and culture festival that brings a ton of money to the economy there. And they shut it down. And for the foreseeable future, they'll be shutting things down too. So, in pockets over the United States, they're doing some of these things, to try to mitigate it. But, the question always comes back to like, how does this jive with the economy, the U.S. economy, and obviously, if you've been following any news at all, you know that the stocks have been flip-flopping every day, swinging 1,000 points or more in a single day of trading, which is nuts. And the question is just begged, like, what are we doing about it? So I looked into it. Evidently, Trump is floating some ideas about an economic stimulus in response to coronavirus. But obviously he's not going so far as to, be authoritarian and lock down a bunch of things or travel restrictions, stuff like that. So one thing that I find interesting about this is that some of the ideas that he's floating, the Fed has already cut, interest rates already, I think, twice by today's count. Who knows? By the time this gets released, it'll probably be again. The Dow Jones Industrial Average finished 2,000 points down, which is 7%, which is huge. And I think that was like the largest decrease in like over a decade. So you kind of have to do something about that because, people are starting to feel it. And now with, different companies and states and areas locking themselves down, the question becomes, do we have to pay our mortgage? Like, how's that going to affect the everyday American? And so a couple things that are floating about as far as like what we are going to do is limited. There's not a whole lot of details coming out of the White House or the Fed for this, but today he met with, President Trump met with some Republican congressional leaders. And they quote have a very substantial payroll tax cut idea, and some legislation to protect hourly wage workers who could miss work because of coronavirus, but it doesn't really provide any details there. And I find this a little bit troubling because I think when I think about China and that's where the virus had started, and they locked down their country, and like for a while everybody's like, that's all the way in China, it's never going to come here, it's fine. And then it spread to Iran and Italy, and then today Italy just locks down an entire country, and our own reported cases are increasing, and we're doing a pretty fucking bad job at mitigating this issue right now. Super late to the game, deploying funding and basically boots on the ground for it. Test kits are highly unavailable, and we're getting mixed signals from leadership on what exactly is going down. So makes me a little bit worried, not necessarily worried that I'm going to get coronavirus, but more so worried like, how's this going to impact me? How's this going to impact, our, the American people?
Well, I think you should follow the Japanese model. I think Japan has had, I may be incorrect about this, but I think around the same number of deaths than the cruise ship that they let in, the Princess Diane, or Princess Diana?
Princess Diana.
Why?
Princess Diamond.
Princess Diamond, excuse me. I mean, what they basically did was they shut down the schools and they told people to stay home.
Right. But not everybody can afford to stay home, to that point. And Italy's made, this very hard decision to lock down their entire country, but they also backed it up with saying, hey, you guys don't have to pay mortgage, and
they're eventually
going
to have to pay that.
Huh? No, we're definitely going to have to pay our mortgages.
They're definitely going to have to pay that mortgage. They're just extending.
Yeah, they're just delaying it, but
they're delaying it, but they're not. Yeah, it's not a freebie of like.
No, it's not a freebie, but I mean, in fairness, it's needed, right? So like, let's say it lasts 2 months, right? All right, well, then their mortgage is now 2 months longer, right? But for those 2 months, those very critical 2 months when they're not making an income, and they're going to struggle to make ends meet, and probably there's going to be a whole lot of stress on supplies and food and basic necessities. People can't be worried about fucking paying their mortgage, and that would be a terrible way. Like, you lose your house because the country decided to shut down. That's fucked up. And
and then you could say, I'm young, I could have survived coronavirus. Like, I'm a healthy young person, I would have had the flu or dealt with the effects, and I still would have gone to work and paid my mortgage.
Now, you would have spread it to a bunch of other people that were at risk, and all of them would die. And there's like moral implications there. Sometimes
not
I think
all
about
of them
that when
would
I go
die.
to work.
Most people, it's not like you get the corona. This is not smallpox. This is not the plague. This is not the bubonic plague. This is at its very least severity, a flu, probably more than that, but it is not like wiping out populations. This is not how many deaths how total deaths have we had? Over less than 100,000 at this point.
Yeah, but I think you're thinking of this wrong. In that respect, the fact that there hasn't been millions of deaths from this, like with smallpox or whatever, we're talking about a super short span of time that this has been lasting, and it's rapidly increasing, and a lot of people are dying. And I think, thinking about it in terms of just straight up death counts is like unempathetic to the people that died or are suffering from it. I think the way that we have to look at it is, being conscientious, so right now, the global economy is, at a point where, there's some serious hardships. An entire country just got locked down, a Western country, and it's not China and one province in China anymore. We're affecting lots of different countries, and so this raises some issues with the global economy. So if you don't want to think of it from the perspective of people are dying, and you want to make that argument, fine. But a stronger argument that you should be paying attention to is like how that affects the global economy, because, as a big part of why the Dow and the S&P have been dropping so heavily has been, a fight about oil, right? So for those who are uninformed in that respect, Saudi Arabia and Russia have been going tit for tat on basically increasing production of oil because of this virus. So the virus is causing manufacturing plants to shut down in China. Travel is reducing, and a lot of these things have implications in the oil markets. As an example, for manufacturing, oil isn't just gas to power a car or a plane or a boat. Plastics and even fertilizers are created and manufactured using oil byproducts, so those things need to be purchased in that respect. And when there is a crisis like this that affects, manufacturing and global trade, oil prices are affected. And when this happens, OPEC, I don't know what OPEC stands for. It's the organization for, fucking oil. the international organization. I probably should have looked this up before we fucking had this conversation, but OPEC basically
it stands for it's the International Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Thank you, Henry, for making me sound dumb. No, but OPEC, they all got together recently and they were like, hey, listen, we need to limit our production of oil because if we can increase the supply and the demand is low, the prices are going to drop. And that's bad for us as oil producers, right? And it's bad for, people who trade, oil commodities. Generally, it's pretty good for the consumers because, shit, even Trump said it was like, hey, great, good for, the consumer. Your price of gas is going to be real cheap now, which is a heavy eye roll on my part. But the point, though, is that Saudi Arabia and Russia have been saying, well, fuck you, I'm going to produce more oil. I don't care. We're gonna produce more oil, and they're going back and forth with this, and it's causing quite a bit of a stir, and with a lot of the things that we talk on this podcast, like sometimes it comes back down to oil, and now I think if you're not on this is a dangerous virus, you should be seriously considering the geopolitical and global implications of its effect on the economy, specifically around oil.
At the very least, you should be concerned about the market effects that the hysteria is causing, because essentially what's happening, and like, to make a long story short, there's so many restrictions on China right now. A lot of the oil demand that would go to China is not there, and like pretty much everything, oil is its price are dictated by supply and demand. So since China does not have that need, or they do have that need, but since they cannot, they can't import all that petroleum that would usually be put on the market, it's affecting a lot of OPEC countries. Specifically, it's affecting Saudi Arabia, and not as much Russia, because Saudi Arabia is in a deficit right now.
Right.
And Russia is not in a deficit right now, and that's why Russia hasn't decided to start producing more oil.
Less oil.
That's why they have decided not to cut up oil. They don't care if the price of oil stays low. Saudi Arabia right now wants to raise the price of oil.
Right, because they need it, because they've been at a fucking war with Yemen forever, and it's crippling their economy. But I mean, like, so I was looking into this just because I wanted to see how the impact of, viruses and pandemics like these affect markets, just to kind of get a gauge for, what happens, right? So found this thing on Bangalore Daily News, which I'm not certain about the source, but they reference Dow Jones data. So this was like the most concise article I can find. So evidently, a main wealth management company looked at S&P Standard & Poor's 500 index and looked at how quickly had it bounced back from other pandemics, like the coronavirus, and basically have come to the conclusion that, within 6 months, most of them have bounced back and even, have increased even higher. So, for example, the S&P rose 9.27% on average after various outbreaks over the last 40 years. That includes SARS, avian flu, swine flu, Ebola, and Zika viruses. But at the moment, it's currently down more than 10%. And that's since the WHO, the World Health Organization, called the coronavirus a crisis, and that was back on January 30th. Also, something interesting to note, to kind of get into nerdy like stock shit, we're at a record high right now for the Dow Jones and the S&P, and oftentimes, the stock market will go into a correction. So, you don't stay at a high forever. It just doesn't keep climbing forever. There's usually going to be a stock market correction when it comes back down to like normal levels. And what sparks that correction is different, depending on what's going on in the world. But this year it just happened to be the coronavirus. And so this guy's saying that we should bounce back from it, right? However, 6 months is a long time. 6 months is a long time, especially for how deeply we've been cut, in our current stock market. We have had record high losses over the last decade in this alone, and this is including, during the financial crisis in 2008. So I'm skeptical about his position, but I tend to believe people who know more about shit than I do. So I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I think the stock market's going to swing back up, mainly because I think this is a reaction to the virus rather than the virus itself that is wreaking havoc. So I wouldn't be. I don't think the global economy is collapsing right underneath us, but it's interesting that we're bringing up Saudi Arabia right now and how like oil prices are really affecting their economy, because this is coming at perfect timing, really.
Yeah, well,
where Saudi Arabia is right now, and I don't know if you want to segue over to this point or if you have anything else to say.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So, if you guys haven't heard, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has been over the past few years, past 3 years really, he's been consolidating power to himself. He is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He is the son of King Salman, and he is the first king, or the first crown prince, really, to inherit the monarchy through vertical succession and not horizontal succession. So typically, there's Saudi Arabia. It was founded basically the third kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is modern day Saudi Arabia, was founded by this guy named Ibn Saud, who was a real badass, who was chopping off heads, who was conquering people, eventually invaded Mecca and Medina, and after World War I was basically given that big slice of Arabia. They call it Saudi Arabia, so it's named after the family. The Saudis were a family; they were a tribe. So it would be almost like if you called the United States the United States of Obama.
Oh, I'm sure we'd love that, right?
The United States of Trump. So, motherfuckers, man. Do you hear that? I'm just going to keep on going.
Go for it.
So, he's been consolidating power. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Ritz-Carlton shakedown, where he threw a bunch of his political opponents in jail, house arrest in the Ritz-Carlton, which is a very nice high-end jail. And there has been a lot of movement that's been going on since he has inherited the title of Crown Prince. And when he first became Crown Prince and emerged on the global scene, a lot of people looked at him like he was a reformer because he let women drive. He started putting radical reform in Saudi Arabia, which is basically a medieval society. He started putting reforms women should drive, and you can look at him as a reformer. I kind of see him as somebody who jumped in front of a parade and said that he was leading it the entire time. I don't think that he is really a reformer. I think that women were going to drive in Saudi Arabia anyway. I mean, they're the only country in that region that is that strict and that backwards in terms of social norms. But he recently had put more people in jail. He threw away the former crown prince, Prince Mohammad Bin Salman, who is a fan favorite of the CIA and the U.S. and John Brennan. And he also threw in jail his uncle, so the brother of the king, so Prince Ahmad bin Abdulaziz, and what the real experts are saying is that he has now completely established his authoritarian rule over Saudi Arabia. In reality, this has happened 3 years ago. Like this, there's really nothing different. He has already consolidated power, and he's had power for a really long time. That's why he has been really doing anything he wants, and not really seeing any. I don't want to say consequences, because he's definitely seeing consequences, but he has complete autonomy on what he's doing. There's really nobody that can really speak sense to him or advise him at this point. And the guy's, for all intents and purposes, he seems like a complete nut job. So I'm pulling up this Reuters report. So Riyadh, Saudi Arabia has detained 3 senior Saudi princes, including Prince Mohammad bin Abdulaziz, the younger brother of King Salman, and Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, the king's nephew, for allegedly planning a coup. Sources with knowledge of the matter said.
A coup? Ooh.
A coup, which is highly believable, honestly. I'm surprised. We said this a couple of episodes back, maybe a month or two ago, that there is violence within the Saudi family.
Right.
Like they kill each other.
Right.
There's coups.
Right. And a coup d'etat is French for coup d'etat.
Yeah. Well, King Faisal was assassinated. There are always there are brothers who are always removing other brothers from the position of crown prince or king. So this is not something that is out of the normal. Like princes kill each other all the time.
Right.
So just looking at the context of where Saudi Arabia is heading right now, with all of their different crises regarding the war in Yemen, along with even the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist / informant.
Sure.
They all have added to his status as a global pariah, I guess would be the best way to say it. So, Crown Prince Mohammed Bin Salman, King Salman's son and de facto ruler of the country, the world's top oil exporter and key U.S. ally, America's greatest ally, has moved to consolidate power since ousting Mohammed bin Nayef as heir to the throne in a 2017 palace coup. So what's interesting about this is that, again, I mentioned this before, he is the son of the king. That never happens. All of the kings of Saudi Arabia, every single king of Saudi Arabia has been the son of King Ibn Saud, the founder of the modern state of Saudi Arabia. It's all been a horizontal line of succession.
Right, meaning brother to brother to brother.
Brother to brother, the brother, the brother, the brother, the brother, the brother.
Well, not that many brothers, but you get the idea.
The brother to brother. It's horizontal. It's not. It doesn't go down to the son. So when he became king or crown prince, excuse me, that was a huge deal, because that had never happened before, at least since the modern state was created. So later that year, he arrested several royals and other prominent Saudis, holding them for months at Riyadh's Ritz-Carlton Hotel in an anti-corruption campaign that caused shockwaves at home and abroad. So yeah, back in if you can remember the Ritz-Carlton shakedown, some people say that it was a consolidation of power. I actually reject that. I don't think it was necessarily consolidation of power, and I don't think this is a consolidation of power. He has already done that since 2017,
right?
Since he was crowned, since he was basically given the throne from his father, King Salman. This was a shakedown because he was trying to put different economic reforms, because, as we could see, Saudi Arabia is an oil-dependent country, and their economy is basically dependent on what the prices of oil are. They're a swing producer where they can produce and they can make up lacks in market or different deficiencies within the market. However, ultimately, their economy depends on the price of oil,
which is why he put forward that Vision 2030, which is trying to diversify, Saudi Arabia's economy to be, post oil and shit.
Basically, Vision 2030, that was like his big project when he was first named Crown Prince. I believe he was Interior Minister prior to that, and he had already been thinking of reforms, but he wanted to diversify the economy of Saudi Arabia and find a way to attract foreign capital into the country rather than just be a sole oil producer. Because what Saudi Arabia is, there's really not too much industry in there besides the petrochemical space. They don't do anything else. Everyone else who's not in the petrochemical space, essentially they're in government jobs. And everyone who's not in a government job is typically a migrant, because business owners don't want to hire Saudis because, frankly, it's a lot cheaper to hire a migrant worker. So in a lot of these oil-rich countries in the Gulf, you see a division. You see different divisions in the Middle East, whether that be Sunni or Shia or whatever, Kurdish or Arab or whatever ethnic group. In the Gulf region, the division is between migrants and the natives, because the migrant population keeps on growing and growing. In the UAE, the majority of the people who live in that country are migrant workers.
Right.
So that's an entirely different political crisis that
right.
most people don't even really talk about or are really forecasting for. But back to this Reuters report. So 5 sources told Reuters that Prince Ahmed and Mohammed bin Nayef were detained in the latest operation. 3 of the sources, including a regional source, said Mohammed bin Nayef and his half-brother Nayef were picked up at a desert camp on Friday. Oof. 2 sources said Ahmad was taken from his home. Yeah, so this guy was literally taken. Guys with black masks invaded his home and just took him. Just took him. And I don't know. This might be my sick sense of humor, but I find these arrests, like the way I envision them in my head, are utterly hilarious. The way they break down, like I can just imagine it. Like a bunch of Saudi police like pops in the door, and then there's like there's like a guy, either getting like a foot massage and him freaking out, like like, and then a bunch of people yelling in Arabic.
Yeah, no, it could be like an episode of like 24 or some shit.
Yeah, I just imagine. It's just, I cannot imagine that in not a humorous way. Like one guy is getting a foot massage and another guy is like
being fed grapes.
Like having grapes fed to him, and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, Hakabosha! Yelling and just taken into a truck.
Yeah.
Maybe I either have a very sick sense of humor or lack empathy towards the Saudi royal family. And I think it's a combination of both.
Probably.
Yeah. With these arrests, say a source, MBS consolidated his full grip on power. It's over with this purge, the source added, indicating that no rivals remain to challenge his succession to the throne. So do you think MBS is just totally just a psychopath paranoid? Or do you think that there were actually do you think there was actually a coup attempt?
I watched enough like Game of Thrones and shit like this to, get the sense that there was probably a shred of evidence that something was going to go down, like a coup. And rather than, you saw what he did with all of those people, all the royal family, and threw them all in the Ritz-Carlton, which is relatively nice, but he's done some fucked up things to other people too. I think.
No, he tortured them.
Yeah.
No, there's a bunch he tortured. Like it wasn't all nice. Like some of them were dealt with in a more of a delicate manner than others, but many were tortured. It wasn't like some nice arrest.
Yeah,
it's really not a way to arrest somebody with compassion. It was more so a complete shakedown.
For sure. And I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that once you cross that line, which he's crossed many, you immediately understand that if you don't hold all the power, if you even slip up once, it'll all come crashing down back on you. Karma's a bitch, and I think he's very cognizant of that. And especially in a political environment like Saudi Arabia, where it's not uncommon to depose a brother or a cousin or something like that. That's fairly common. So I think this is a logical response from Mohammed bin Salman.
It is logical, and I wouldn't doubt there was a coup attempt. And this is what the source says. Another source said that princes were accused of treason. A third source said that they had been discussing a coup with the support of powerful tribes, but had not reached advanced stages yet. Powerful tribes. I wonder what that means. Like, powerful tribes sure as hell doesn't mean like the Banduan tribes in Arabia. Yeah. Like, powerful tribes means the United States of America.
I mean, maybe.
You know for a fact it's like a coup. If there was a coup in Saudi Arabia with the princes, it would have the blessing of the U.S. and back of it, and it wouldn't be the Trump administration that would give its blessing. It would be an administration that had most likely a Democrat as president. And I'm not saying that facetiously or as like an insult to
Democrats.
Even though I insult both political parties as much as I can, I mean it in a way that the former Bin Salman is more of Trump's guy and Kushner's guy and Netanyahu's guy. I think he was identified by Kushner and Trump, and I think to some degree probably element of the Likud party as like a guy who's friendly with their interest. And on the other hand, Ben Nayef, the crown prince prior to MBS, he was more of an establishment CIA type guy. Like he was better with like Brennan's of the world and mainstream Democrats and Republicans likewise. I mean, Pompeo gave him, I forget what medal, but he gave him like the Distinguished Medal for fighting terror or whatever it was, because Ben Nayef was the head of Saudi intelligence for a number of years and had even been injured in a terrorist attack.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is beyond political. I think it's like, I agree with your assessment that, this wouldn't happen under a Trump administration, but not because he's a Republican, but because he's Trump. I mean, and that's not saying anything bad about Trump. I'm just like, look at the evidence, right? Like he's pretty chummy with him, and, if you look at people like Kushner, who has, like you said, identified him as friendly to their interests. And if you look at, their propensity to continue selling things like F-35s to them, even though they're also going to purchase, Russian weapons when we don't like that when Turkey does that. It's just abundantly clear that like a Trump administration is not going to believes that Mohammed bin Salman's interests are aligned with them, so it won't happen under Trump. And if Trump isn't president anymore and it's a Democrat, the likelihood increases. But I think the likelihood would equally increase with, some other Republican that just doesn't have the same set of interests that the Trump administration does.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I think that all of these princes are monsters. So I'm not even singling out like MBS,
right?
More so than other ones, even though MBS is a complete madman. But I do think that one of the big reasons why MBS took power in the first place was because the Trump administration identified him as somebody who they liked, and he wouldn't have been able to do so without him. All right, let me go on. So it was unclear where the princes are being held. There was no way to contact them for a comment on the coup allegations. You can't get them for a comment.
No comment.
No comment. They, princes, have to be treated with dignity, the third source says, referring to the stature within the family. Okay. The regional source and another source said King Salman had approved the move and described him as mentally and physically sound. So there are rumors of him being in a coma, which are completely false. Mm-hmm. So if you read that King Salman is in a coma, then it's wrong. But there is evidence that he has dementia. He does not. King Salman is probably in good health for somebody his age. However, he is also incredibly old, and he also can't get dressed in the morning. He cannot
As
have
many
a
old
speech
people.
that's not read off a script. I read somewhere that he was reading a speech, and he forgot that he said it the minute after he read the speech.
He forgot that he read the speech.
He forgot he read the speech like immediately after he read it, and it was like, oh, I need to read the speech. So he doesn't. He is elderly, and he is probably mentally incapable to combat anything that the rest of the monarchy really does. Apparently, if you want to hear something juicy, apparently MBS didn't let his friend, his card buddy, come into the palace. So
Why?
he has, I don't know, he just didn't let him in. So he's a big card player, and I don't know what the card game was, but he has his buddy come over to play
Magic
cards
the Gathering.
Yeah, it was Magic. It was Pokemon cards. Magic, Pokemon or
Yu-Gi-Oh.
Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh. He came over, and he was denied access to the palace, and they were like, "Nope, you can't come. You can't play cards here anymore." And
Take your Yu-Gi-Oh deck and go elsewhere.
they ripped him up, and he was like, "No, my Charizard."
Oh, my Exodia card.
Oh, you son. That's how you know things are getting really serious within the Saudi royal family.
Yep.
They're ripping up first edition hologram cards.
Yep. Signaling the end to the to the kingdom of Saud.
Signaling the end. Crown Prince Mohammed, 34, has fueled resentment among some prominent branches of the ruling family by tightening his grip on power. Some critics have questioned his ability to lead after the 2018 murder of prominent journalists by Saudi agents in the largest ever attack on Saudi oil infrastructure last year, sources have said. They said royals seeking to change the line of succession view Prince Ahmad, King Salman's only surviving full brother, as a possible choice who would have support of family members, the security apparatus, and some Western powers. And yeah, some Western powers means all of them, most likely, besides like the U.S. right now.
Right.
But there's an election coming up, so who knows? Maybe there was a plan to
Interfere into the election and make sure that Joe Biden becomes president.
I doubt that there was really a plan to interfere with the election. Maybe that's what foreign governments.
I don't know. That's
do.
that's the new normal. So
foreign governments always try to fight for things that are in their interest.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's possible. Here, this is purely speculation, so I'm just reading an article and just kind of commenting on what I do know about the Saudi royal family and giving pure speculations, because if you're trying to guess what this family's thinking, then good luck. I think what's possible is that maybe there's some type of conspiracy where if let's just say Joe Biden wins, then they'll connect and remove him from power. And they're doing that under the condition that Joe Biden wins the election. Who knows? It could be, and maybe MBS could have found that out, because I don't think he's probably even being paranoid at this point. There probably are real threats to his monarchy.
Oh, there's without a doubt real threats to his monarchy.
He's a 34-year-old. He's a 34-year-old Saudi prince who's never done anything like what he has done. There has been nothing like what he's done as far as taking power, consolidating so much power at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean, he's 34 and they reign for fucking ever. Like, look at his dad, you know? So, yeah, dude, he's gonna, if he sticks around, right? He'd be in power ostensibly for the next, like, almost 60 years, probably, you know, until he gets dementia.
Yeah, and the last thing anyone wants is that guy being in power for as long as he could possibly be, because that would be like a 40-50 year reign, assuming that he is in good health. So fuck, I just lost the article. Here's something funny. So Several Saudis on Saturday tweeted photos of the king and his son under the hashtag "We are all Salman, we are all Muhammad" in a show of support. So there is some support.
Some domestic support. How much of that do you think is just like bots on the internet?
Well, it was a photo, so those photos couldn't have been bots. I have yet to see the photo, so perhaps.
I mean, is it a single photo? Because if it's a single photo, there should be a bunch of bots.
Perhaps there is a Photoshop of that.
I don't know, man. Deep fakes are real. You got to be careful with those.
But I mean, the rest of this article goes on. I don't think I need to read the rest. You get the point that there was a coup against Mohammed bin Salman, and allegedly, most likely, like, come on, there's probably was a conspiracy to take him out, and he started throwing people in jail, and he's a bastard, and that's what bastards do to consolidate power. And this is all coming under a time where Saudi Arabia is under a lot of financial pressure, as we were talking before. The government's 2020 budget was supposed to have $50 billion deficit, or about 6.4% of the Saudi GDP. But that was the reason why this is important is because that was based on the estimated crude oil price of between $62 to $63 per barrel. And they assumed that crude production would be around like $9.8 billion a day, 9.8 million barrels per day, excuse me. In the first week of January, crude reached $69 a barrel, but it dropped to $45 a barrel as coronavirus started destroying the global demand. And that's where this connection, where the oil war between Saudi and Royal come together, because the Saudis try to make a deal with the Russians to cut oil production together so they could keep the price up. But Russia rejected it because they don't really have a budget they don't have a deficit within their budget, or a budget deficit. And in addition to this, and Russia's also trying to compete with like U.S. fracking and stuff like that. What makes this worse for Saudi Arabia, though, is that they're also taking a really big hit on tourism. 20 million tourists per year travel to Mecca and Medina, and Saudi Arabia has prohibited foreign pilgrims from entering both of the cities. And I think by the end of July, they were expected to have 2 million pilgrims. So if Corona continues, the pilgrimage, or the Hajj to
Mecca and Medina,
are going to have to be completely called off, and that's a huge income for them. You don't think of Saudi Arabia as a tourism spot. It's not a place.
Muslims all over the world go there.
But we're talking about billions of Muslims who make a pilgrimage there. There's other tourism besides just like going to Vegas.
Right.
So this is about several tens of billions of dollars that will be missing from planned government revenue. So MBS is fucked.
Right.
And we haven't even brought up Yemen.
Right.
I don't know if you saw, but the Houthis have they recently shot down a Saudi jet. They just revealed a bunch of new anti-aircraft that they have.
I did see that, yeah.
The Saudis have been trying to back off and they were trying to maintain some type of ceasefire with the Houthis for a while, but I mean, bombing raids have continued. They are not winning this war, and they're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars, and they are losing this war in every single capacity. I think it's important to did you see that video of the Houthis revealing a bunch of their new anti-aircraft missiles?
It was pretty sick.
Yeah, they are in huge trouble. So not only does MBS have to deal with these internal problems from this probably wouldn't be happening if he was creating security for his constituents, because most governments, they don't really give a shit about the people. They care about pleasing their major constituents
right.
and that help them gain power. If he pisses them off, I mean, that's going to be the end of his ultimate reign. And you have to understand with the Middle East and how a lot of these Middle Eastern countries got rich. Saudi Arabia is kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah, we've said this before. Yeah.
Yeah, they're the Beverly Hillbillies of the Middle East, as in they literally just struck oil and they got rich. But there's a lot more to it than that. That's just kind of like a funny way to say it. The Middle East and North Africa, like MENA, they have 5. You can kind of, if you were going to put them in a taxonomy, or if you're going to categorize them and how their economies work, or at least like their development structures, there's 5 ways that you could do it, or there's 5 types of countries in that region. You have really, really poor countries like Yemen and Sudan. These countries are completely poverty, and they're in complete poverty, and they depend on agricultural development. And there's really just not that much hope there. They're just in such poverty. And then there's countries like Turkey, Egypt, and Morocco that don't really have oil, but they have large populations and they have an agriculture sector. These countries will typically try to develop their economy by increasing their manufactured exports. You have countries like Israel, Jordan, and Tunisia, as well as Syria, what you can even throw in there. And you would even throw in, if Palestine was an actual state and not occupied, then they would probably be considered this as well, that have small populations, but they have zero to no resources. So they invest in human capital and educating their people. And then you have countries like Libya, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar, who have a lot of oil, but they don't have a large population. So they're dependent on oil revenues, and they're also dependent on foreign investment. And then you got finally you got countries like Iraq, Iran, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia that have a lot of oil, have large populations, but within these groups, you have within the latter group, all these other countries have a humongous degree of political turmoil going on.
Mm-hmm. More money,
so
more
Saudi
problems.
Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is also the exception because they have the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world.
Right.
And it's dirt cheap to produce oil there, to extract oils there. So, like, Middle Eastern economies are dominated by 3 simple facts. There's little rain. Like, the region receives less than 20 inches of rain a year.
Right.
Which makes unirrigated agriculture just...
It's impossible.
Either just incredibly risky. And there's many young people. The majority of the populations in these regions are younger than 30. And then there's oil. It's a big thing. The first thing that you think of when you think of the Middle East is oil. If you were going to do a little brain chart thing, you'd be like, what do you think of the Middle East? Sand, Islam, terrorism, oil, war, jihad. Like, that would be the things that would pop up in a brain chart, which I don't agree with. I think there's a lot more to that region than that, but the common person would probably write. Those are the first thoughts. The region is not rich in non-hydrocarbon mineral resources, but it still contains 2/3 of the world's oil supply. Mm-hmm. And what's important in an economic point of view is that Gulf oil is the cheapest oil in the world to produce. And like anything, the price of oil is always determined by supply and demand. Demand-side forces played a crucial role in pushing the prices to an extremely high level in the 1970s, and then they played an extremely important role in lowering them in the 80s and 90s, and then pushing them up again back in the late 90s. And what's really interesting about like oil prices is that in the 1950s and 60s, the relative price of oil was low, and eventually the reason why they were low is because a lot of countries were still using coal, but eventually they started moving off that and moving to oil. And in the 1950s, they started realizing, and this was going on prior to that, like the British started using oil in their ships rather than coal. Everyone really saw that oil was the future. The writing was on the wall. But the main reason why all these countries started witnessing the advantages is because it's cheaper, it's easier to store, and it's better. Like, it has more energy.
More bang for the buck.
There's more bang for the buck. And at this time, the U.S., I mean, it still was a major oil producer. And during the late 1950s, domestic oil producers persuaded the U.S. government to restrict imports of cheaper oil from the Middle East. And this is when the U.S. had a surplus of oil. And the whole reason of having a surplus of oil at that time was to protect itself from, and its allies, most importantly, post-World War II, from price shocks. However, in order to protect domestic producers, the state had to regulate oil production to control prices. So in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the growth of demand for energy, it outpaced the expansion of domestic energy supplies. So by 1973, the U.S. had no spare capacity, and that's when they started to rely on Middle Eastern oil. So it wasn't like Saudis struck oil and they all of a sudden got all this wealth. It was a gradual process because the U.S. already had their own domestic oil production. And it was a process of where these giant oil companies were eventually surpassed by these nation states. And that's what happened. There was a battle going on between nation states and oil companies. In the early 1950s, the 8 major international oil companies had managed control over pretty much production, refining capacity, as well as sales. And I guess the best example that you could really use is that, William Darcy, we've talked about this in a lot of different podcasts.
Yeah, fun story.
Essentially, when oil exploration was in its genesis, it was really easy to find oil in the Middle East. And the British would send exploration teams to go walk around and basically step in oil. They did this by just... It's interesting how they found this and how they knew the search in the Middle East. They did it by reading history books and just saying, oh, like the Romans used to the Romans used to use... they used to use basically Molotov cocktails off their ships as incendiary weapons, and then Muslim towns in the 13th century would have oil lamps. So they figured that there would probably be oil in that region. So they sent teams to go find oil, and they eventually found it in Persia. And at the time, prior to them actually finding the oil, William Darcy, who eventually became the director of the Anglo Oil Company, which is now modern-day BP, he signed a concession with the monarch at the time of Iran, the Hujjas, which were very terrible leaders in Iran. The oil concession they signed, I believe it was more than 70%, meaning that Iran would get, or Persia at the time would only get, I think it was between 30 to as low as 5% of the oil revenue that would come out of the ground there.
I wonder how they roped together that deal.
They were super high. They were notorious opium addicts.
Wow. Oh.
Yeah.
So don't do drugs or you'll be raped of your oil resources.
Yeah, apparently the monarch in Persia at that time, they were really bad drug addicts. And that's what happens when you do drugs and you run a country. You sell away most of your natural resources.
For some more drugs.
For some more drugs. Well, the British at that time, they control the opium markets, and they could threaten them by closing them off.
Oh, man.
So they can stop the supply of opium into
Nothing like
Iran.
cutting off a junkie, man.
But what eventually happened is that in the 1950s, Mohammad Mossadegh was elected president of Iran, and he he nationalized Iranian oil, and he kicked the British out. BP responded by refusing to market or refine the oil, and then the British government went over to the U.S. and they basically begged him to overthrow Mossadegh, and they did. The U.S. they we've talked about this a number of times in the show. They couped him. They overthrew Mossadegh by paying protesters to act like they were pro Mossadegh and cause riots by Kermit Roosevelt, who's actually an incredibly interesting person. Kermit Roosevelt.
Yeah, Kermit was badass.
Which I want to get
in many ways.
Kermit Roosevelt is a very interesting person, but he was the brainchild of overthrowing the Iranian democracy that they had set up in place.
Didn't he straight up buy newspapers in Tehran to like write whatever the fuck they wanted as like their propaganda?
Yeah, it was.
It was just like, here's a bunch of money, go figure it out. And he was like, all right.
And the pretext was that Kermit Roosevelt said that he did it because apparently, from what I've read conflicting sources, but I don't know how much Eisenhower knew about what was going on with the CIA in Iran. I think they knew what was going on, but they didn't know exactly what was going on. They didn't know
willfully
to the extent,
ignorant, you know.
They were willfully ignorant. Like, oh, the British want them out. You said they're communists there, because that's what Kermit Roosevelt wrote a book called Counter Coup about removing Mossadegh from power, and his pretext for what he did, because he was very much a lover of the Middle East. He was a very hardcore believer in Arab-Anglo unity. He thought that the best way to fight communism was creating a relationship with the Arab countries and supporting their independence. He was very pro-Palestine. He condemned a lot of the human rights abuses of Palestinians. He was also an American nationalist, and he was a complicated person, and that's why I find him so interesting. But besides that, that kind of, because the cost of oil was so low that like even independent oil companies were able to enter into the market, and the monarchs like post Mossadegh, like the Shah of Iran that took his place, and then King Idris of Libya, they would cede oil. They would continue to cede oil concessions. Not only did this have like major consequences for the development of many of these countries, selling cheap resources and not selling cheap resources and not creating like manufactured or finished goods typically is a recipe for disaster for a developing nation. What eventually changed, though, was, and what really set the stage for the explosion of oil prices was the 67-day war. And they're talking about the 6-day war in 1967 between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. One of the consequences of that war was that the Suez Canal closed, and it required Gulf crude to be transported around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which is long.
That's a fucking long
which
trip.
is really, really long. So the longer that oil's in transport, the higher the price is, because it's just the transport. It's just
the demand goes up, right?
The demand goes up. The cost of shipping it goes up. And what happened was that the Europeans, especially in Western Europe, they started relying on Libya, and Gaddafi in '69. He overthrew King Idris. And once he overthrew King Idris, who was basically kind of like a puppet monarch in Libya, he started demanding an increase in the posted price of oil. And after he did that, other oil-rich nations in MENA, they started following his lead. It was after the October War in 1973 that really the shift from consumer and company control to it shifted out of the hands of consumer and company control to nation states and producing governments. And what really solidified this was when Richard Nixon, he gave the Israelis $2.2 billion in military assistance during the Yom Kippur War. This is what prompted the Saudis to embargo the U.S. Everyone knows the stories about the really long gas lines when the Saudis embargoed the U.S.
Right, that's when they butchered the Mustang and made it like tiny.
Well, yeah, the embargo created a panic of buying on the open market, and the Shah of Iran, I think Nixon expected the Shah to make up that extra oil that was to ramp up production because
the Shah.
Nixon,
come on,
Nixon,
Shah.
the Shah.
Come on, Shah, you gotta make some more oil for me, Shah.
Oh, come on, Shah. You're my buddy, Shah. There's a really good book called Oil Kings that goes over this in like really good detail. And Nixon and the Shah were pals. They were good pals, apparently.
Maybe even more.
The way that it's presented is that they were both awkward, isolated people who had something in common with each other. Both isolated, calculated people. But what the Shah did, he didn't do what Richard Nixon wanted him to do. And we were selling the Shah a fuck ton of weapons. We sold them basically everything except the bomb.
Yeah.
As in a nuclear bomb. We gave them anything that they wanted as far as,
you
the
want
Shah
tanks?
was a
Cool.
policeman.
You want F-14s? Cool. You want whatever you want.
They gave him F-14s. At the time,
Yep.
The British didn't even have the F-14.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Shah did is that he auctioned oil in order to get the highest price. So he just put the oil up for auction. Eventually, the Saudis and Iran, they made a deal. Iran being, the price hawk, wanting to raise the price. The Saudis wanted to keep prices lower. They settled at $11.65 a barrel. But at this time, all access oil capacity was in OPEC countries. And the rest of the world really had no alternative to buy crude oil. They had to buy from OPEC countries because there was a shift from corporate and private control of oil companies to these state-controlled oil nation states. They're oil monarchies. They're oil nation states. And then there was the Iranian Revolution, which removed about 2 million barrels a day from production, which is a really large amount of production to remove from the open market. And the Saudis responded to that by actually lowering production due to the conclusion of the Camp David Accords, which set up another really big round of panic buying. And this is when this happened, like when the only alternative to buy crude oil was at the hands of OPEC countries. That's when you start seeing these large, enormous transfers of wealth from the West and to the rest of the world to these governments, dictators. You see an enormous transfer of wealth from the consumer to basically despots in the Middle East.
Right, and this is
that's how all of these countries got rich.
Yeah, and this is how they're able to like spring up a giant megacity in the middle of the desert with no water,
Yeah, like that's how you see these huge construction booms in the 80s. Like Saudi Arabia had the largest construction boom of all time in Riyadh.
I think to this day they have something like 25% of all of the world's cranes in Dubai. Of all of the world's cranes. That's a lot in one city.
Yeah, these populations are small. They're relatively small. Saudi Arabia's population is bigger compared to the rest of the Gulf, but it's not the size of Iran. It's not the size of Iraq even, population-wise. It's big in the region. But Jesus Christ, the amount of money that was transferred to these Gulf oil producers was the largest in history. There's nothing you can compare in that amount of time in the 70s when these countries got rich. And
what I find really nuts, and especially in the context of what we were talking about earlier with coronavirus, is just how fragile all of that shit is, you know? Just how utterly fragile it all is, because, you know, easy come, easy go, as they say, right? You know, you step in a bunch of oil, and now you're one of the few countries who can produce this, and the, you know, global demand goes up, and then you become rich overnight, basically, you know, overnight being like a relatively short span, you know, in history. And something as simple as, you know, people being freaked out about, you know, a virus, which objectively isn't like going to kill everyone, but still some areas for concern. But because of, you know, the reaction to this, it drives the demand down, which exposes, you know, how frailly put together, you know, those economies are, you know, places like Saudi Arabia and others with small populations but huge amounts of relatively small populations but huge amounts of oil and oil revenue, you know. So I think it's just like some interesting context, because, you know, this spat between Russia and Saudi Arabia right now, you know, is about oil primarily. And, you know, it makes you think, like, they were totally unprepared for this, you know, with all the things that we kind of discussed is going on in Saudi Arabia, you know, whether it be coups or wars or, you know, kind of the deficits in their GDP, they just utterly incapable of dealing with this here. And Russia doesn't have this problem and isn't playing ball. We gotta, I mean, as a species, we really got to get off this oil shit. Not as a not trying to be a global warming hippie here, which I agree with, but, you know, just generally speaking, the fragility of the markets, that, you know, that it could just crash at any point because of how weak these OPEC countries are.
It's just ridiculous to think that these countries have such power over the global economy.
Right.
And it's just kind of crazy. Like, Saudi Arabia is as backward as you can possibly think of in this world.
I mean, it makes you think, you know, are they backwards because they are rich, you know, or were they always backwards and we just gave them a bunch of money, you know? And I think it's kind of a combination of the two. It's not super simple, right? That's kind of a false choice there, but, you know, holy shit.
Well, you got to look at the birth of Saudi Arabia, because this Wahhabism, you know, what everyone tries to conflate all of Islam as,
right,
is Wahhabi, which is not
right.
Islam. It's a variation of Islamic interpretation.
Right.
Like Wahhabism, what they practice in Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism, what those rebels, those freedom fighters in Libya and Syria practice. Wahhabism is a new phenomenon.
Right.
It was invented in the 18th century,
mm-hmm. and
it was invented in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was a political tool used by the Al Saud, the Saudi tribe, along with the religious cleric Wahhab,
mm-hmm.
and basically it was a political unity. And
right.
essentially what happens, you see this in Europe as well, to legitimize political authority, they need a blessing of a religious identity.
Right.
Or the religious blessing.
Right. I mean, we talked about the 30 Years' War and how, like, basically the Catholic Church was blessing the Holy Roman Empire in that respect.
But basically, like, Wahhabism was a very conservative Islamic movement that rejected the vices that were brought in by the West along with the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the Salafist needed a authority to protect them, meaning the Saudis, which were a badass tribe in in the Hejaz in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Saudis needed a religious or at least a political identity to recruit people with. So there was this nexus that was formed with this tribe, along with this religious strain of Islam that is not, which is does not represent most Muslims. Most Muslims are not incredibly chauvinistic or intolerant as what they practice in Saudi Arabia.
But you stick them in an oil country and you give them a ton of money.
But
and then
you stick them with the oil country, and also the fact that it's a monarch. A monarch needs legitimacy from God, so they have. I don't think the Saudi princes are as religious as a lot of the people who are in the general public. I think that they just use religion as a tool to legitimize their monarchy rather than them actually believing in all this stuff. King Abdullah, the king before King Salman, got in trouble for taking a picture with women who were topless. And when I say topless, I mean they didn't have their burqas covering their face.
You got in trouble for that?
You got in trouble by the religious establishment. So you have religious zealots that are more radical than that family who live there. However, it's in the Saudis' interest to push that agenda for their own interest. And it's also a useful tool for them because, let's just face it, the Saudi military sucks balls. They may have an expensive military, but
they suck.
They can't beat a bunch of guys dressed up as Jesus in Yemen. A lot of ways that they project their power is through religious fundamentalism and spreading the ideology of Wahhabism across the Muslim world, along with Eastern Europe and former Soviet bloc states,
right,
and in Western European countries like Belgium and England and Sweden, anywhere where there are large migrant populations. They purposely spread that ideology and fund these very extreme mosques to project their own power.
Right.
It's just a whole fucked up system.
Right. And domestically, the point that you didn't bring up there is that, this is also still super precarious because while they might be playing this Wahhabism card, they're also keeping dissidents at bay by effectively subsidizing the country, with the oil revenues that they have, right? So I don't think it's just the spread of Wahhabism that's keeping them in power and legitimizing them. It's also
no, you're right. That's an excellent point.
It's also this like faux prosperity that they're able to impart upon their people. Again, middle of the desert, nevertheless have some of the biggest buildings in the world. And it, if you go to one of these places or just look at a picture on Google, you'd think they're the richest country in the world. And in many respects, per capita, they kind of are. But, again, super precarious position, they presume to, be religiously, indoctrinated by spreading Wahhabism. But, then they get in trouble by, they're the harder religious people for doing something as simple as taking a picture with women who aren't wearing head coverings. And okay, cool, so we'll back that up with I'll just pay you. I'll just give you a monthly stipend, because we're rich with oil money. And something like coronavirus comes along and global demand for oil goes down, and they're like, well, fuck, where are we going to get all the money to pay off all these people?
That's exactly what happened. That's why the Arab Spring didn't happen in Saudi Arabia,
right,
is because they're able to subsidize the living conditions of people who would normally be unemployed. So everything is subsidized in Saudi Arabia. Not everything, but most of the things that you need for basic welfare are subsidized. Mm-hmm. Meaning your electricity, your housing, your health care, your water to some degree. Mm-hmm. Water is scarce there. Everything is subsidized by the government, by oil revenues. So if you can graduate from university or not even university and you can count on getting a cushy job in some ministry, then what's the point? Like, fucking Arab Springs happen when half the country is unemployed, like in Iraq right now. Iraq, most people are, it's the majority of the young population is unemployed. That's when you get real strife. When you get real strife, you get real political turmoil when people are not economically sound. And the way that these Middle Eastern countries are structured is that there's so many complicated ways to hit. Like, everyone tries to hit one topic or blame one thing on the Middle East. Some people just blame everything on, imperial oil interest. Other people blame it all on, like, it's all Islam, that's why they're backwards. Other people are like, everything is Israel, it's all Israel. Other people just, it's a combination. Like, all these things may be kind of true, but it's like a combination of a bunch of different factors. But I think the biggest factor is that a lot of these governments have been, they were kind of forced. They were kind of built on the foundation of providing their populations with jobs and the basic needs, and it is impossible for them to do a lot of the things that they say they're going to do. It's impossible for them to provide for every single person in that society, and it's also impossible to keep up with the employment needs of their country, because the government just can't make 1 million jobs, because those people are going to, even if you do create 1 million jobs for one generation, though that generation is going to have more kids. The Middle East is a very fertile region.
Right. As you pointed
People
out.
are popping out kids like crazy.
Yeah.
And
they're all young there too, as you pointed out earlier.
They're young, and what's different between the Middle East compared to other countries is that usually the more comfortable your life is, the more kids that you're going to have, because you're going to be able to provide for them. In the Middle East, that's the exception. In most Western countries, typically with the standard of living or with the rise of GDP, you see people having less children. In the Middle East, it's the opposite. But also, there's a phenomenon of people having a lot of kids when they're poor as a hedge of losing a child. So you have massive amounts of fertility. The people who are not having kids in the Middle East are typically just the unemployed males who are younger than 30, because, let's just face it, it's hard to get a chick when you're unemployed. Right. So there's a lot of factors, but I think the primary factor is that there's massive amounts of unemployment in many of these countries, and they don't have the industry inside the country to create enough jobs, and there's nothing that these governments or any dictator can do. And Saudi Arabia is no different from the others. They just have a enormous cushion called petroleum that they're able to sit on, along with other Gulf countries like Qatar and UAE, who actually were smarter, and they diversify their economy through real estate and tourism and things like that. So I don't anticipate them being in like the same issues, because Qatar has Qatar Airways and television markets, and have diversified their economy more so than Saudi Arabia has. But Saudi Arabia is completely dependent on their oil revenues, because the standard of living will increase and decrease as oil prices fluctuate, and that puts them at a huge risk going forward.
And that's
all right.
And that's that.
That's that. Yeah, hopefully that is I don't know how to end this one.
Just like that, man.
Oh yeah, there's Syria. I would bring some stuff up on Syria, but all right, there's a ceasefire going on as we speak between Syria and Turkey, negotiated between Russia and Turkey. At this point, covering what's going on there is like covering a football game in weekly increments, because things are changing so fast on the ground as far as territory is concerned that it's like you can't. Yeah, you have to wait like every month to cover Syria, because things are just they move so fast there that it's impossible to whatever you say about what's going on in Syria right now will be irrelevant the following day. So we're staying on top of it, though.
We'll round it up as soon as there's like a bunch of more developments.
And what else is going on? DNC stuff.
Oh man, I don't even want to touch that yet, but
yeah,
shit, we'll have to get to that point soon, I guess. Yeah.
All right, let's end this piece.
All right,
guys, peace. Rate and review the podcast if you enjoyed the show, and we look forward to having you join us again. Peace.